Over the past year, there's been a consensus that Tears of the Kingdom was a disappointing game. In this video, I wanted to cover one aspect specifically, the memory storytelling. What is interesting to me is that despite following the same format as Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom felt wildly more disjointed. The difference isn't the mechanic itself, but how that mechanic interacts with the kind of story the game is trying to tell. Let's start with what works with Breath of the Wild. To start off with, the story was less about giving new important information to the player, but rather giving context that makes the player feel more integrated into the world. Early on in the game, King Boss-Rama's Hyrule tells Link the story's overarching ideas. Link was Zelda's knight, Ganon attacked, Zelda is now trapped in the castle, and Link needs to save her, and so on. As a result, the memories aren't progressing a plot so much as fleshing out characters in an already understood story. The player already knows the story's outcome, so discovering memories out of order doesn't disrupt the narrative. Instead, we get a glimpse of the world before the calamity, making Hyrule feel much more somber. It really sells the idea of a ruined, melancholy world and adds to the environment of the game, and gives an emotional weight to the player's goal of defeating Ganon. The non-linearity works here because the story it is telling doesn't rely on a structure. With Tears of the Kingdom, however, the memories, this time called Dragon Tears, are doing something very different. In this game, the cutscenes tell a separate story about Zelda in the past. And as a result, the story feels largely disconnected from the Hyrule that Link explores. The cutscenes surprisingly do not explain the sudden resurgence of Zonai technology, and it doesn't provide much character development to Zelda, and none to Link. There are multiple ways this could have been framed differently, keeping the same distant past storyline. The story does introduce the Zonai, and in theory, the cutscenes could have centered more heavily around their technology and their conflict with Ganon. That might have allowed the player to build a stronger connection between the past and what Link is actively doing in the present. The story could have focused on Link trying to stop Ganon's exploitation of their research and technology and their conflict with Ganon. Instead, the emphasis on Zelda's journey creates a sense of separation. The player is effectively switching between two narratives that do not meaningfully intersect until very late, with the reveal of Zelda as a dragon. That brings us to another major issue. Because the world is fully open, the player has no controlled sequence for viewing these memories. In a system built around linear narrative, that becomes a problem. If a later memory is discovered early on, it can undercut the progression of the story, making earlier memories feel redundant. However, there are games that manage to tell linear or mystery-driven stories within open worlds. A clear example of this being Outer Wilds. Like Tears of the Kingdom, it involves uncovering a fragmented history of past events. However, it structures that discovery through what can be described as knowledge-based progression. In Outer Wilds, progression is not gated by explicit barriers, but by what the player knows and understands. Information leads to more information, but only if the player has the context to interpret it. As an example, imagine after defeating a boss, you find a diary on the ground that has a code, a picture of a waterfall, and a note that says, "Don't forget your keycard." On its own, that information is incomplete, but now the player will be watching for more clues to connect it to. You find a keycard from a puzzle that involves looking at an old spaceship log, teaching you about a crash that happened years ago. Then a local farmer tells you about a strange group of people driving through town with a large metal box. When you follow the farmer's directions and some tire tracks, you find the waterfall that matches your picture, which has a hidden door behind it with a code. Written across the door is a mysterious message, and a symbol that you've seen before. You enter the passcode, swipe the keycard, and enter a secret lab. You get the idea. Through the system, game developers can be sure that the player has seen a certain amount of information before reaching the gated area. For instance, if the player enters the aforementioned secret lab, the game developers would know the player was strong enough to beat a boss, so they could throw a harder challenge at them within the lab. Additionally, the lab could also expand on the idea of the crash, which was introduced when finding the keycard. There are a couple ways these ideas could apply to Tears of the Kingdom. There could be multiple tiers of cutscenes, with a couple entry-level ones that would give the player clues of where to go next. This way, there's some variation in how the player finds the information, but twists later on are kept hidden. Alternatively, there could be specific quests, dialogues, or other clues that would lead to the next memories, somewhat controlling the order of viewing. This method controls player understanding to some level, but it also allows the freedom of figuring out each aspect at your own pace. For instance, there could be many clues leading to the same memory, meaning that each player's experience would be different. Another example of a game that does progression in an open world is Sable, a game about a young girl finding her place in the world. One of the mechanics are masks, which you earn by talking to the right people and completing tasks. Depending on which mask you wear, you'll have different interactions with the people around you. This mechanic requires exploration before jumping straight into progression, meaning that it can somewhat control the player's experience to not be too overwhelming. These same ideas could also be applied to Tears of the Kingdom. For instance, what if after completing each dungeon you get an armor piece or helm that you can equip that makes regional villagers react and tell you information about the world? Or what if characters were able to react to the sages that are surrounding you when you have them turned on? Or maybe the sage abilities could allow for access to new memories, with one final memory that requires all 4 abilities. That way, as you progress, you gain more information slowly. Nintendo clearly aimed for a larger scale, more involved narrative, but without intentional control over narrative progression, the story became less impactful. One of my favorite side quests from Breath of the Wild is Tarrey Town, which had Link traveling across the map and slowly building up a town. It was a quieter, more personal feeling that made my Breath of the Wild experience more exciting than ever. Leaning into that feeling, focusing on present-day rebuilding or protecting Hyrule, could have been a more engaging angle, instead of trying to recreate the same retrospective storytelling of Breath of the Wild. Let me know if you see ways a different open-world game could be applied to Tears of the Kingdom. And, as always, there's so much more I could say about Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. Despite any criticisms, I do really love these games, especially Breath of the Wild. But that's it from me for now. Stay safe. Talk to you later. Bye.